Tonight we have a question before us, is the party over? Subtitled, The British Left in Crisis. I'm Emily Jones, I'm an associate professor here at the Blavatnik School of Government. And as a School of Government, we want to be a space where we can debate the future of government, and that's an important moment for Britain, an important moment particularly for the left. As the blurb mentioned, we've got a bruising new leadership contest underway in the Labour Party, member set against member. The Labour Party, some would say, looks like it might be on the verge of splitting. Who is to blame? Would British politics benefit from a reconfiguration? And what other reforms does the system need in the wake of the Brexit vote? It's hard to believe that actually it's only 4 weeks ago we all went to the polls. So a lot has happened in 4 weeks. There's Harold Wilson, who's attributed with saying that a week is a long time in politics. And I, for one, certainly felt like there were days in the last month where an hour felt like a long time, as so much has happened. So just to remind you, in the wake of the Leave vote, Prime Minister's resigned. There was a swift and pretty brutal, some would say treacherous leadership contest within the Conservative Party. Theresa May is our new Prime Minister. We have a new cabinet with key Brexiteers figuring out Britain's place in the world. We have Boris Johnson heading up the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. David Davis is our new Brexit Secretary. Liam Fox as our International Trade Secretary, all sharing a house together. So we'll see how that works. Before the vote, it really looked as if the EU referendum might break the Tory party. But the cleavages, and there would be cleavages that the opposition might be able to seize upon. But instead, in many ways, we've seen the Conservatives quickly rearrange their furniture and busy rebuild, while the Labour Party is trapped in a prolonged and agonising leadership battle. We have five. One of our panelists will be joining us in a few minutes. Excellent panelists to discuss 3 questions we've put to them. One, to explain to us a little bit about where we're at. What's the nature of the crisis that the left is in? How serious is it, and what are its implications for our democracy and the health of our parliamentary system? To help us to understand how we got here. So that's the second thing we've asked them to do. And the third, which we'll probe during the questions and answers, is where we go from here. Do we need new political parties? Should we change our electoral system? And how is Labour going to reconfigure itself? So what does the future look like? I'll briefly introduce the 4 speakers who are here, and the 5th as and when he arrives. So our first speaker will be Tim Bale, who's a professor of politics at Queen Mary and the University of London. He's written 2 books relevant to tonight, one on Ed Miliband's leadership of the Labour Party. Hi, come on in. Just on time. And a book on the modern history of the Conservatives. And you're currently leading a project studying political party membership. So that's an important topic we'll get to, I'm sure, in detail tonight. Our second speaker is Isabel Hardman, who's assistant editor of the Spectator. You won Journalist of the Year, I understand, last year, so congratulations for that. And we all hear you on Radio 4 regularly, particularly with the Week in Westminster, so we're looking forward to your insights. Our third speaker will be Anthony Barnett, writer and founder of the Open Democracy website, which we're all familiar with, one of the really successful left-wing publications, online publications, and a very eminently respected figure on the Labour left. Our fourth speaker, sitting just next to me here, is John McTernan, who's a commentator and former political secretary to Tony Blair. So that sounds like a kind of hot seat you're in there. Chief of Staff to Scottish First Minister and to Julia Gillard when she was Prime Minister of Australia too. And our 5th speaker, welcome just in time, John Woodcock MP, Labour Party MP for Barrow and Furness, a chair of the Parliamentary Labour Party's Backbench Defence Committee, amongst other things. So I've asked you all to speak for about 5 minutes. I'm going to cut you off at 7, and then we're going to open up for questions and answers. So please have your questions prepped. We are live streaming, so we'll have microphones roaming for the Q&A. Great. So Tim, over to you for a maximum of 7 minutes, please.
Sure. Thank you very much. I know it's Marxists that are supposed to see crises everywhere and crises as imminent. Now, I'm not a Marxist, but I do think that the Labour Party, and I want to some extent, just talk about the Labour Party for the moment, is in a crisis. And I think it's a crisis which does actually deserve that cliched prefix existential. I do think that if Jeremy Corbyn wins this leadership election, and I think on the balance of probabilities that seems to me the most likely outcome, then a split in the Labour Party, while it's not inevitable, is, I think, surely on the cards. I'm not a Marxist and I'm not a rational choice theorist either who sees economics in politics all the time. But I do think that there are certain disincentives to leaving the Labour Party that have existed for a long time, but are actually now shrinking away. In other words, I think that for moderate MPs, or as some people see them, neoliberal sellout traitors, the disincentives for staying are actually in some ways quite strong. I think that Labour MPs are in the position that if things carry on as they are, then many of them will face the loss of their seat at the next general election. I think it's probably true to say that the days of three-figure majorities for any party may be over in this country, because it strikes me we are in some ways becoming a multi-party system, albeit one trapped in a two-party electoral system, if you like. But I would expect many Labour MPs to lose their seats, and probably directly to the Conservatives. And that's if they actually make it as far as the election, given what Jeremy Corbyn has said today, although it's not actually his decision, it's the NEC's decision in the end about reselection and deselection rules. It is possible, perhaps, that some MPs will not actually make it through to become candidates next time around. I also think that the disincentives that there had been in the past for leaving the Labour Party and setting up some kind of new formation are reducing as well. Yes, we still have first past the post, and that clearly favours two big parties. However, if a large number of Labour MPs, just to pluck a figure out of my head, 172, were to leave the Labour Party and form another party, Continuity Labour, although that's a terrible name, I can't imagine that's the one I'd go for, then it would be a very different prospect from 1981, where just 29 Labour MPs broke away from the party and the majority stayed. There would also, I think, be no prospect of any of the big beasts in the Labour Party, such as they are these days. I'm not sure that there is anybody of the calibre necessarily, obviously, present company accepted, of Dennis. When I wrote this, I didn't know you were coming, so you know, I'm not fast enough on my feet to change it. But you know, I don't see many of those big beasts staying around in the rump Labour Party that might still exist. And of course, if that were to happen, and we are talking, you know, 150 or so Labour MPs forming another party, they would almost automatically become the official opposition in Parliament, were they to register another party. Because to become the opposition in Parliament, you simply have to be the biggest party that is not in government, and that would be them. That would therefore mean Jeremy Corbyn just leaving a rump of Labour MPs in Parliament, and I simply don't think that Jeremy Corbyn has got the appeal or the experience of Michael Foot even. So I think that there would be a good chance that actually this new party could displace the Labour Party. Obviously people will say, well, funding is a problem, but given that the Labour Party has managed to raise £4 million in 48 hours, I think in the era of crowdsourcing it would be possible to raise money for such a party. Obviously, you would have to do without the union's financial backing, but I'm not so sure that that is the biggest advantage for a party of the centre-left, given the fact that the unions themselves are shrinking and are not seen to be vital forces by most of the public. And I would expect some unions anyway to come back on board, because after all, one of the reasons that the unions put money into the Labour Party is because they want a centre-left party in government. Obviously, there will be the issue of members, and that's something I'm particularly interested in, but I don't want to go on too long about that. But members are both an advantage and a disadvantage, and I am pretty sure that this new party could, if it wanted to, go out and get itself some new members and would take some members from the Labour Party. So, in other words, I think a split is possible, not necessarily imminent, and I think it's possible in practical terms as well. There are disincentives to doing it, but I think they are reducing. There are incentives to doing it, and I think they are increasing. To answer the second question very briefly, how did we actually get there? Well, I always say to my students, you can basically explain any political phenomena four ways. You can talk about it in terms of contingency, accidents happening. You can talk about an institutional explanation. So what is it about the rules of the game that produced this scenario? You can talk about agency. In other words, what is it that political actors have done or not done to make it happen? And you can talk about structure, more kind of profound things going on underneath. And I think, as always, where we are now, on the left anyway, is a mixture of all those four things. Contingency, long time back, not very far back, but it seems a long time now. Gordon Brown not calling the election in 2007. More proximate contingency, Eric Joyce not getting drunk in a bar in the Houses of Parliament, punching someone and causing the decision to change the way that Labour organises its leadership campaigns. Contingency, the fact that 36 Labour MPs gave Jeremy Corbyn their nomination, most of them, or at least a good number of them, because they wanted to see the debate widened. What about institutions? I guess the rules that the Labour Party set up for its leadership elections were not foolproof, or to quote John, not moron-proof. They allowed Labour MPs, I think, to forget their essential gatekeeping function, and therefore caused Jeremy Corbyn to be on the ballot, and the rest is history. Agency, I guess Corbyn fought a fantastic leadership campaign. His rivals did not. What about other aspects of agency? You can go all the way back to Blair and Brown and say, well, we live in an era of valence politics where competence is everything, but competence isn't absolutely everything. And I think one of the problems perhaps of the Blair-Brown era was, while they stressed competence, they didn't perhaps do enough explaining about what they were doing, and some of the good things that they did, as far as Social Democrats are concerned anyway, were whispered too quietly, perhaps. Structure, and this is where I finish. I don't really want to talk about the economy, others might do that, but we do live in an era where the state market dimension, the left-right dimension, is increasingly being supplemented in politics by another dimension, a vertical dimension, if you like. Call it open-closed, call it libertarian, authoritarian, whatever you want to call it. But the cultural dimension in politics now is becoming as important as the economic and social dimension in politics, and I don't know how the left actually copes with that. If I look around Europe, it's not doing very well. And to finish up, I've given quite a kind of detailed explanation of why Labour is in trouble, but if you look around the rest of Europe, it can't be a coincidence that social democracy almost everywhere, apart from perhaps Croatia at the moment, is not doing particularly well electorally, organisationally, or in terms of ideas.
Thank you, Tim. And one thing that springs to my mind is this: if you think of then having a big Labour Party, or sort of continuity Labour Party, and then the sort of rump Labour Party, who appeals to those who voted Leave? Yeah. And I'm not convinced that the continuity Labour Party is going to do that. So one question I think for us all is to think about how post-Brexit we appeal to that Leave group on the left. Isabel, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, I just want to caveat any predictions that I unwisely make during the course of talking to you. With the fact that I've managed to get every prediction wrong in the past year and a bit. So I was so confident that Labour was going to be in government after the last election that I actually held an interview with a shadow cabinet member about what he was going to do in government until the week after polling day, and it sits on the hard drive of my computer, never to be used. I also wrote a post saying that it was quite sweet that Jeremy Corbyn was standing for leader, and look what happened to that. So with that in mind, do listen very carefully to what I have to say. I think that the future for the left in this country, it looks at the moment as though it's not going to be focused on Parliament, which is obviously a problem. You have a leader of the Labour Party who doesn't really believe in parliamentary democracy. If he did, he would certainly take more time in preparing what he does in the chamber. He's often quite lacklustre, slapdash about the way that he asks questions, the way he approaches Prime Minister's questions, the way he responds to big statements. He actually managed to forget to mention that Ian Duncan Smith had resigned after he did resign when he appeared in the Commons a few days later. And that sort of lack of attention to detail suggests that he doesn't particularly believe in the power of Parliament. Now, if Jeremy Corbyn doesn't believe in the power of Parliament, the members in the Labour Party at the moment certainly don't. They don't think that the Parliamentary Labour Party are really that important, even though they represent the general electorate who voted for them. Jeremy Corbyn quite often talks in a slightly saucy way about his huge mandate and how potent it is. And actually that the members are very much taken with that, but the mandate of Labour MPs combined is even bigger than Jeremy Corbyn's mandate. And yet it doesn't matter because Parliament isn't an important forum for change, according to the Corbynites. And this division between the members and the PLP is obviously the clearest at the moment with Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. All the polls that we've seen suggest that Labour members are still very much in favour of Jeremy Corbyn. They think he's doing a good job, even though actually when they're asked whether he can lead Labour into government, they suddenly lose their confidence. They say that he's principled and honest and decent, but they don't seem to think that government, that having a majority in Parliament is important, which again takes us back to the lack of interest in Parliament as a force for change. Now, if Jeremy Corbyn does win his second leadership contest this summer, what will then happen, I think, is a revenge of the Corbynites against those MPs who backed the vote of no confidence in his leadership. And you'll see deselections or reselections or a failure to reselect Labour MPs in seats after the boundary changes. And Corbyn was talking about that today. And he made it sound very reasonable. He said, you know, MPs will be able to put their names forward and we'll have a full and open reselection process. But actually what that means, or what it suggests, it seems to me to mean, is that actually the incumbents who are currently serving their constituents will have no natural advantage in a reselection battle. And it will be the Labour Party membership's way of saying, we don't like you, so we're going to get new MPs who we agree with, and show that the Labour Party has changed forever, basically. Now, some Labour MPs may actually feel that it's not actually worth sticking around, or that deselection is a blessing in disguise anyway. I have to say it's not particularly cheerful meeting up with Labour MPs at the moment. I'm starting to think I might charge by the hour for my services as a councillor, which is not a particularly great place for the party to be in if they're turning to Spectator journalists to talk about how miserable they are. One MP who I was speaking to recently said, oh, this is a bit like an agony aunt session. I thought, my goodness, this is really not good. I'm actually writing down everything you say and I'm going to use it in a story. I'm not here to help you. But Labour MPs are very miserable. Being an MP isn't a particularly fun life. They get a lot of abuse online. Another MP who I was talking to said that they actually had read the words, you're a traitor, so much that they now actually believed it about themselves. And it would be weird and incredibly thick-skinned and lacking in the empathy that you need to be an MP for them not to respond to the amount of abuse they get by feeling very down. And if you talk to most Labour MPs who are sort of sentient beings at the moment, they are quite miserable. And the idea of continuing for another decade in Parliament, achieving absolutely nothing, certainly not being on the front bench with Jeremy Corbyn or one of his followers as leader, doesn't look particularly appealing to them. So the other thing that I talk to Labour MPs a lot about is their CVs, about all the things that they're doing to embellish their CVs for a life outside of Parliament. Lots of those MPs are people who actually Parliament could really do with having sticking around, and that means a great loss to Parliament. But again, that doesn't really matter to the Corbynites, that they're going to lose a huge amount of skills and experience to inexperienced people who don't really appreciate Parliament either. And finally, the prospect of a split, if those moderate MPs think, well, this isn't worth it, we can't stay under Corbyn's leadership, let's split off. There's obviously a huge amount of nervousness about the experience of the SDP, but I was talking to one key figure from that movement, and he pointed out that actually, while you had a small number of Labour MPs going over back then, this would be a huge bulk of the parliamentary party, which would be much more powerful. The thing that I think is probably the biggest barrier to that is that the moderates haven't really worked out how to recruit members. Now, Tim, I have to disagree with you when you said that it would be quite easy to crowdfund resources for this. I had a briefing from someone who worked on the Liz Kendall campaign last summer that they would be able to use a sort of Just Giving style model to recruit hundreds of thousands of members to vote for Liz. Well, in the end, she got 4.5% of support. And unfortunately, before that, I swallowed this briefing and wrote it up in a Times column, which is the worst column I've ever written and takes us back to the danger of listening to anything I predict. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Isabel. I think one thing to bear in mind here is just the popularity of Corbyn amongst the grassroots membership, as you've mentioned, because as I understand it, the Labour Party is now as big as it's ever been, right? So it's back into the sort of Blairite years of it, sort of, it's bigger. So it's the biggest it's ever been in terms of memberships. Because it's an intriguing... We'll come back to this. We'll come back to this because we've had this surge in the last week. But I just think we do need to sort of, it's a question we need to bear in mind, is the sort of health of the Labour Party, an aggregate, and then the split with the parliamentary Labour Party. Anthony, over to you. 7 minutes, please.
It's very nice to be here in this amazing new facility. I was asked, we were asked to talk about, is there a crisis on the Labour Party, and if there is, what's its nature and what should be done about it? And this reminded me, going way back into the 1980s, when people that wrote books went on television rather than entertainers to talk about politics. Watching a program which has stayed with me since, when Umberto Eco was on a program, must have been on Channel 4, who's the great Italian novelist, with Stuart Hall, who was a great cultural theorist. And Stuart was naturally talking about the crisis of the left. And Eco said this thing which sort of brought me short, which is why I still recalled it quite vividly. He said, why is it whenever he comes to Britain, people talk about a crisis with a very long face? We in Italy, he said, we have good crises. We can... And I don't know whether he went on with this analogy, but it stuck with me, that obviously it's very dangerous to compare the body politic with the human body, but anybody who goes through adolescence has to go through a crisis. These can be extremely painful. Sometimes it can be suicidal, so it's not something to mock. It's not that it isn't hard, but it's a crisis of life. It's a crisis of growth. So there are good crises and bad crises. And the Labour Party, and I think this is also true of the British political system as a whole, and there's a kind of relationship between the two, is going through both a good crisis and a very bad crisis, reflected in some of the remarks we've just heard. And the good crisis, just to start on the more cheerful point, is it's a crisis of democracy. For 20 years we've been looking at various books, Peter Mayer and so on, the sort of work that Tim is an expert in, of hearing people lament the way in which politics is being hollowed out, people are not joining political parties, nobody's being active, and now hundreds of thousands of people are joining political parties, and everybody's saying, oh dear, this is a terrible problem. So we've got an acute problem of democracy. It may be that they are joining these parties for I accept the point in terms of the Labour Party that this extraordinary democratic surge has condensed upon and chosen in a sort of quasi-religious way a figure who can't win elections and who is sort of, in a certain sense, politically disabled. And therefore that does present a real problem for democracy and for the will to change. But where I think I disagree with you is that I think while the hundreds of thousands who are joining are not maybe in one sense that interested in Parliament as they see it, a Parliament they see as hollowed out, as ineffective, and as not offering them a choice, they do want change. They're not just doing it in order to lose. So there's a good democracy which is there. And the bad democracy, just to be very quick, I've only got 5 minutes, is that the Labour Party, as we have known it, the historic the Labourism is finished. It's basically, we're talking about a political organisation, political party, which has lost its mission. And I say that in this sense, that it was originally invented, or one of the key organisers was a Scotsman who created a party for the working class and for the trade unions. And when that went into the dust under the impact of Thatcherism and globalisation, a new Labour Party, also invented primarily by a Scotsman, by Gordon Brown, and Tony Blair, who went to school in Scotland, created a party of globalisation and, rightly, not to be mocked, of neoliberalism, which to some extent worked, although it brought us the Iraq War. And this party also has failed, and the key measure of this failure is it's lost Scotland. And the association of Corbyn with that party is that he has been unable, I think he gave his 5 points for his new programme yesterday, they're all about sort of victimhood and the disabled and the downtrodden, and there wasn't a call for a renewal of democracy, there wasn't even a call for renewal of education. There was no, and it's not a matter of saying that it wasn't aspirational enough, it wasn't engaging with the forces which are changing this country. And Corbyn himself cannot accept that Labour is now, in effect, an English party. Okay, so it's English and Welsh, but the Welsh are being used by the English as camouflage to allow themselves to appear to be British. The Labour Party is an all-British party built as part of a great British political project. And that's the project which has now come to a crisis point with the Brexit vote. And you can see, the reason why I want to make this comparison quickly is that Brexit is also, just as the impulse behind Corbyn is a democratic one, the impulse behind the Brexit vote is a democratic impulse. And I want to emphasise that because many people who, like myself, were for Remain, are trying to say, well, it's all lies and it was all, you know, it was sort of somehow we were cheated. Whereas the Remain campaign, I'm afraid, which is lamentably led, completely failed to deal and to touch the core issues of sovereignty and democracy and self-government, which took people who were worried for economic and other reasons over the edge in terms of this very dangerous and pernicious populist slogan of take back control. The response to this, my answer for what the left or the Labour Party should do, is we need to get back to Europe. We need to become and to know how to become a democratic European country. And we need a party of the left that is capable of saying it is an English democratic party. It wants to have an English democratic constitution, a civic, a pluralistic constitution, as every other country in Europe does. And the simplest way of putting this is that Scotland, who understands its own parliament to be rooted in the sovereignty of its own people, and Northern Ireland, which has gone through a constitutional revolution with the Good Friday Agreement, which integrates the European Convention into its structure of government and is in an international treaty, and is a form of a written constitution for Northern Ireland. Both of those countries were happy with being European and voted by very large majorities to remain. And if we need, and this is the only possible project for a party of the left to lead this country back or towards that kind of a that's his democratic program. And until we have, however democratic those people that have supporting Corbyn or who are joining the Labour Party are now in terms of identifying their hopes with him, unless they have a program which can articulate a democratic way forward and take that on, then they will not be able to resolve their democratic crisis with all of its potential in a way that will be positive.
Thank you. So you moved us from the idea of an existential crisis in Labour to a sort of crisis of democracy, but hope for renewal. So the idea of a good crisis.
And linked to a much larger a United Kingdom crisis,
Yeah,
which is
Yeah.
still coming.
thank you. John, over to you. Let's hear what you have to say for 7 minutes, please.
Okay, what's going on? What is really, really clear, if you look at it properly, is there is a global crisis on the political right. That's the most obvious crisis that there is in politics at the moment. Simply stated, the leader of the global conservative movement is Donald Trump. Now, a snigger, right? If I'd said in the 80s Ronald Reagan was the leader of the global conservative movement, there'd have been some respect for an ideology, for an approach to the world, to world affairs. Donald Trump is it. The success, he won't get elected. The only Tories, Conservatives, Liberals in Australia, Christian Democrats in Europe, the only ones who can get elected is by basically plagiarizing the Clinton, Blair, Schroeder playbook. So Angela Merkel is a Christian Democrat who runs a social democrat government by incorporating the social democrats. Malcolm Turnbull in Australia, he got the premiership because the leader, Tony Abbott, was too right-wing to win. They had to adopt the policies of John Key or Harper in Canada. Right-wing parties have no ideology, and they cannot get elected if they move to the core of their empty ideology. You can see it with Trump. You can see it with Cruz. None of the people there were electable. There's a global crisis of the right which covers over the fact that nobody has replaced, and this may or may not be a problem, but nobody's replaced the third way as an analysis of how to do things. And the truth is, the huge triumph of the SDP in their split from the Labour Party was that they dominate and still dominate British politics. Blair was the expression of Owenism, as was Cameron. The only way to get elected was to be like a Blairite. And look at Theresa May, who clearly doesn't believe a word she said, but on the steps of number 10. But she had to express something which is like recooked Milibandism. So that even a Tory like Theresa May had a sweep of her cabinet. She didn't have the confidence to articulate a conservative ideology. It's a crisis of the right, which is a real one. Why are we here? Well, I don't fully agree with what Tim said, because I don't think there are separate economic, social, and cultural things going on. There's economic turbulence, which is described always as the winners and losers of globalization. But you tell me where I can find in Britain a loser of globalization, because we have got one of the lowest levels of unemployment we've ever had. People are in full employment. They have plenty of work. They get well paid. The country's living standards have been restored after the global financial crisis. There is not actually huge pockets of people who are actually suffering because of globalization. There are people who suffer because of cuts from the Tory government, which are unnecessary because we're one of the richest countries in the world. That's a completely separate thing from the crisis of globalization. But there's a perceived economic turbulence around globalization, which is real, and we can talk about that. But there's a cultural crisis, which is one of social and economic rights. And it's really important to understand that a lot of the rage that powers the right in Britain and UKIP and in America under Trump is a rage at equalities. It's a rage at the equal place that women and minorities now have and have achieved. And that's a crisis because they believe that's reversible. Now, in any economic argument, politically, there's always a bargain to be held. But there's no bargain with people who are opposed to equalities. Those people cannot be allowed. You cannot reverse civil partnerships. You had to take it forward to equal marriage. You can't reverse equalities for women and minorities in this country, in America, or any other country where they've been established. So those things are there in our politics. But the big thing that sits underneath every single element, is, Anthony's very good at the kind of huge scale of things. This is all about the global financial crisis. This is all about the fact we have a political class on left and right who have no way to explain what actually happened in the GFC and the Great Recession. Because what happened was the banks nearly destroyed the world economy. The banks had to be bailed out so there wasn't a depression, and no bankers went to jail. Now those are all true, but no politician can explain all three of those things. They can do 2 out of 3. They can the left can say why the banks were bailed out, but can't explain why the bankers weren't jailed. The right can't explain why the bankers crashed the world economy. You've got a problem when the leadership, the political classes, can't account for what's actually happened to us. And a lot of the deepest concerns we have, the animal spirits in politics, Because the crisis in Britain as a crisis of right and left is really clear. It is, you have to go back to 1997 to have a party that got supported more than 40% of the electorate in Britain. Maybe 2001. A third of voters in the last 2 elections have voted for anybody other than the Labour Party and the Tory Party. The last three elections have been won by a party on 36% of the vote. That means a third of voters are looking for something different. Now, what that was in 2005, it's not clear. What that is now is some account, at least, of what the changes are that are going on and where it's going to go. Where does this all go for us? Where does it go from here? For the Labour Party, most people believe in good money after bad, and that's probably where the Labour Party will go, which is people will kick the can down the road. If Corbyn gets re-elected, they'll say, well, next year. Next year there's an election for the United General Secretary, so next year maybe Gerard Coyne will win, and the old AEU will be back in charge. The old West Midlands right wing will be back in charge, and none of those changes will go through conference. There'll be no mandatory selection. There'll always be a reason not to leave. There's always a reason not to split. There's always a reason to say, let's stay here. Because it's hard to split. And the big reason it's hard to split is I would not want to leave those people, Corbyn and his people, with the name, with the heritage, the history, and the achievements of the Labour Party. And that's a very big deal to do that, to leave. It's a very big deal to leave that stuff to people who really shouldn't be in the Labour Party in the first place. I don't have a view about the members who've joined. I've got a very strong view about John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn. They should not be in the Labour Party. One of them is a communist and the other one's a member of the Fourth International. But the big deal is there is still a crisis for the Tory party, and that crisis is Brexit. Because Brexit can't simply be described, as the Prime Minister tries to do, as saying Brexit is Brexit. That's not even as useful as saying gravity is gravity, because at least that means something. But think of where we are. We have a racist Foreign Secretary for whom the best excuse that can be given is that he was trying to make a joke when he used the word pickaninnies. It's just racism. It's indefensible. He shouldn't be Foreign Secretary. We have a Minister for International Deals who should not be allowed to have anything to do with a contract, even if it's a contract to do with a golf club or an after-school club. He is an extremely dodgy minister with his record. Huge questions. And we know what he intends to do, which is do any trade deal he can, because what's the cost of that? Everybody in the country knows a deal can be done on any terms as long as you accept the other guy's terms. So do you think the People's Republic of China would like to do a trade deal with us? Of course they would. Do you think it'll be on our terms or their terms? It won't be on our terms. And the places most exposed economically to Chinese manufacturing all voted for Brexit. So a tariff-free trade agreement with China will promote a crisis as economic and social and political. Because whatever happens to the Labour Party, the Tory party have to manage this Brexit thing. And the Brexit thing is a thing. It's not a good crisis or a bad crisis. It is a crisis. It is a crisis so large, we'll still be talking about it in 10 years' time when I come back here. It's the big fact of our lives. And that is Britain in crisis. It's not, is the party over? Britain's not over, but the model on which we lived together and gave each other a health service and gave each other education and gave each other a lot of the certainties that we had that underpin it, we've thrown them away in a situation where we still have an underlying economic crisis of productivity. So the big facts, the huge facts about the economy come back again and again. Can the Labour Party, and I'll finish on this point, rise to that? It has the ability and the capacity and the capability to rise to that. I don't think any of the issues that we face are too complex to actually deal with. At the moment it cannot, because if you do not have a leader who can lead, you do not have a party that can form a political response to the biggest issues of our time.
Thank you. So you reminded us that actually the existential crisis is on the right as well as the left, sort of a much bigger picture. I'm going to turn to John Woodcock. Now, John, you're a Labour MP. We've heard two different views about where the Labour Party is going. We've had one view that there's going to be a split, and another view that really it's actually quite hard to think about this 150 plus MPs defecting because of the heritage. would be great to hear your thoughts again for 7
I mean,
minutes.
I'm just basically here because I thought this would be a safe space for a while. I wasn't going to be denounced as a red Tory traitor, but
I'm not taking notes, you're fine.
yeah,
We're
no,
not
but-
live on
but-
TV or anything.
but now I'm here. I like to try to keep the morale up within my party colleagues at the moment because it can be a bit of a tough time, and I like to remind people, and we talk about times in the Labour Party's 100-year history where things have been more difficult than this, and there are a couple. And then I remind them it's almost certainly going to get worse from here, so we may as well enjoy this while it lasts. No, sorry, right, okay, I'll try to be serious. There was a hell of a lot of food for thought there, and I will start with just some observations on where the Labour Party itself is, and then finish it, if I can, just trying to take on John's thoughts on what are the larger international global currents on which the Labour Party is being buffeted or potentially smashed against the rocks because of. First of all, on the sense of the split, I don't think there is any serious appetite amongst the Labour MPs who, in their overwhelming majority, said they had no confidence in Jeremy Corbyn. No matter what the result of the leadership election that will end in September, we have partly seen the lesson of the SDP, and we have come through a culture which is that actually the ones who left and tried to do what they always tried to do, but within a different group, did wrong, and they were the ones who were called traitors and splitters. So it's something which is ground into the vast majority of people who were staying, and it goes very deep. Now, but that doesn't mean that you can return to, probably goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway, that you can return to harmony if Jeremy were to win, because 80% of people saying what we did, no confidence in the leader, and going to all of the length that we did to say why this cannot possibly work, in my clear view, then cannot go, oh, well, okay, he's won another election, or we'll go back and form another shadow cabinet, unity shadow cabinet. I mean, it would be absurd to do that. So you have a situation which is, I guess, unprecedented, where you have the leader of the parliamentary party who insists on staying on, and has reaffirmed if that were to be what happened. But in any other organisation, if you have 80% of the people around you saying there is no chance you can do this, there's no chance that they would stay in any council chamber or anything like that. In the private sector, it just wouldn't happen. So you have this standoff. Now, we are not going to be the ones who walk away from the Labour Party, but nor can we go back to where we were. So answers on a postcard as to what would happen. The final thing I would say on that, though, is there is a fundamental disagreement within our party at the moment. This is not just a case of, were you right to have private sector involvement in public services, or were some of the things that the last Labour government did on the crime and social order agenda maybe a bit far, or maybe a liberal interventionism has had its day. This is about what the political parties are for, and this was touched on before about parliamentary democracy. Now, I think it would be a mistake to see this in terms of, is Parliament where it's at, and is what happens in the chamber where it's at. It is on a more, certainly not in day-to-day terms, but this is about what is a Labour Party for. Is it there to win general elections and implement change by having a majority in the governing legislature and forming a government, or is it there to be a party of protest? And many of the people who have come in to the Labour Party explicitly support Jeremy Corbyn just do not believe in what is our clause 1 of the Constitution, which is to win elections. I think you cannot have been Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell over the last 30 years and think that winning elections is important. That is not what they're about. And now they're leaders, it's not what they're about now. And so a key question of how this election will go, and I think actually we could win. We could win back the party just trying to be an electoral force in the way that we're not at the moment. But that will hinge on what was mentioned before about, do the people who are currently supporting Jeremy, are there sufficient of them who have been sort of taken in by a lie that they are telling people, that they're trying to dupe their supporters with, which is, this is okay, this can work, we can storm to a majority. Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell and the key people around him know that it isn't true. Now, how many other people have joined the party because they think it is true and are going to potentially, hopefully, see that actually they're being duped? And how many are people who, when push comes to shove, don't necessarily want to change the governance of the country but are happy being where they are? And that, I think, has to be, rather than did Owen Smith, who did he work for, and the leadership quality, and who said what, and how was this person on the sofa of Good Morning Britain this morning compared to the other guy? And it is a shame they're both guys. It's about what is the Labour Party for, and we have to try to make this leadership election about that fundamental question. Now, to finish, how did we get here? Now, there is occasionally a game that a very select few of us play to try to cheer us up, which is called Crimes Against the Labour Party. We have to sort of make the point about different figures over our last 10 or 20 or 30 or more years about who is guilty of crimes against the Labour Party and why. Now, as we are apparently being live streamed here, I'm not going to say any more about that. But completely separate to the idea of crimes against the Labour Party, you look back to the new Labour government. Now, what are the mistakes of the new Labour government? And I take a different view to many of my colleagues. My view is essentially that the government did not lose its way and did not betray what the Labour Party is about, and it didn't lose its purpose. But two things happened. One, three things very quickly. One was that we did not pay proper attention to our base of supporters and take them with us and get a new generations of supporters. So we created a growing tension amongst that. Two, the people, and this remains a case to this day, people who have wanted to seek power in the Labour Party, coming after the people who are in power at the moment, have always seen that tension, seen that there is a way to exploit it for their own political gain, and gone there in a way which has helped them personally, but has made it more and more difficult actually to be in the space where Labour and the centre-left can govern. And the final thing which happened is, I think, that the centre-left and social democracy, and this is why I think I maybe disagree with you, John, but I'd like to hear a bit more. I mean, I think social democracy across the world has been broken or is still going to be broken on this, I don't know, metaphor, iceberg of the great financial crisis. Because, you know, there were governments of the centre-left who were in power, who were talking about the relationship between public and private, talking about the financial sector as actually part of growing the economy. And what have we had since? Well, we had the global crisis, of course, but we've had in the news this week the first generation ever, the millennials, who are earning less than the generation above them, and wages have gone down and down and down, and people are lacking in hope. And so what you see on the centre-right, hence Trump, and I think the reckoning, if it hasn't come for other parts of social democracy in other countries, is going to come, is people saying essentially that the centre cannot hold, and people going to political voices and movements which are not ultimately about governing, which are about evoking an anger in what has happened. And we now face, as my concluding point, I mean, the Labour Party now faces a problem on two fronts. One, that we haven't been nearly as good as we should have done in renewing what centre-left social democracy can can be after the crash. And even if there hadn't been a crash, from renewing ourselves in government, we never properly did it. But also, even if we could do it in a way which could appeal to the electorate, I mean, trying to convince the Labour Party current electorate that is the way to go. My goodness, I mean, you know, look at what this debate is so far about. We are quite some way from talking about choice in public services and, you know, all the kind of things that when John and I were part of the last Labour government advisors were talking about. So it's tricky.
Yeah. And I think you've got there, within the Labour Party, the parliamentary MPs, you've got the membership and then you've got the electorate. And I think they're quite distinct groups that aren't, you know, syncing up. So we've heard a lot from 5 excellent speeches. Thank you very much. I'm going to open up for questions. I'm going to take them 3 at a time. Before I do, so just to remind you, we've heard a lot there about the existential crisis on the left and the right. I think we've got some really big, profound questions on the floor about the nature of parliamentary democracy, about globalization and inequality that perhaps are underlying quite a lot of this. And I think quite a few questions again about how we relate Brexit and the leave. So I'm going to take one gentleman here, gentleman at the front, and a lady. Where's a lady with a question? None burning? Okay, gentleman at the back. So, yeah.
Jonathan Leader, oh, thanks. Get a microphone. Jonathan Leader Maynard, I'm a departmental lecturer in the Department of Politics and International Relations. Two, I'll try and keep them very brief, questions. I work on ideology, and I would like the panel to talk a little bit more about the ideological weakness of the left, by which I don't mean the weakness in the quality of ideas on the left, but in the force with which they can be disseminated. One of the key problems we're clearly facing, or the left is clearly facing now, is that public opinion is in large respects convinced by myths. There are important falsehoods which have become hegemonic. And they become hegemonic because whilst the trade unions have collapsed and mass party membership until recently had collapsed, they have been trickled in day by day by day by a largely right-wing news media, or at least that's one of the routes. I'd like some comment on that. The second question is, I feel we need to disaggregate the Corbyn phenomenon more.
Just to understand the first question well, so the left needs to be better at communicating myths?
I don't know what this, no, not at all. How do they respond to that? I think the left is just weaker in ideological force, right? Not in quality of ideas, but in the ability to get their ideas to convince the public. How do the left respond to that?
Let's leave it there, because I've got
all right,
one
okay.
question. Thank you very much. Second question.
Thanks. Hello, my name's Archie Brown, Emeritus Professor of Politics in this university. It seems to me that part of the problem is the Labour has fallen for the kind of heroic vision of leadership which Tony Blair encouraged, and the parliamentary party is to blame for accepting Ed Miliband's suggestion that the leader should appoint the shadow cabinet. If the parliamentary party still elected the shadow cabinet, Corbyn would have been in an impossible position. Even he would have had to resign if the shadow cabinet, you know, was day after day advocating policies he disagreed with. If he couldn't persuade them and he couldn't accommodate himself to that view, he would have to go. And so I think even in this leadership election, instead of saying Corbyn's not a leader, what his opponent should say is the more important thing, is that Corbyn cannot keep a strong and representative team together. And Labour should emphasise the team much more and get away from this idea of the heroic leader. People got fed up with Blair latterly, and the whole question of Corbyn not being a leader is missing the point.
Yeah, great, thank you very much. Then, gentleman at the back. Yeah, just, yeah. Sorry, can you speak up a little bit? I don't know if the mic's working well, but...
It's on.
Oh, it is now, yeah.
Thank you. A recent report by the LSE. I looked at media bias.
Yeah.
So my question is, if there is media bias and it's not working with regards to what the soft left would like to see, what other options have they?
In terms of then communicating ideas?
Yeah.
We'll just, okay, we'll leave it at that. That's fine. Good. Let's come back to the panel then. So we've got 2 questions, I think, about communication, partly about how the left communicates its ideas, and one about bias in the media, so the reporting of those ideas, and then this question of heroic leaders within the party. Isabel, do you want to kick us off with some thoughts on those?
Well, I think that the media was often quite unfair to Ed Miliband when he was leader. But I have to say, I think that really as journalists over the past year, we've just been working as transcribers, and we've really just been writing up what Jeremy Corbyn has said. And one of my colleagues in the lobby today was getting a lot of grief from a Labour activist who was saying, I don't know how you've managed to twist this quote, what is your source? And he just directed him to the BBC website where Corbyn was actually saying it verbatim. And I think that this is Corbyn's key problem, is that he's not a communicator, and he also has absolutely no desire to engage with things as they are in terms of the media. And Ed Miliband struggled with that too, but
Sorry, you're looking at me, but you're not answering the question. Sorry.
shall I keep going, or do you want me to stop?
Well, it would be good if you addressed the question, if you're addressing me.
No, surely not someone from the momentum heckling from the back.
I don't believe it. So out of character.
But I think let Isabel finish. If you feel it hasn't been answered, we can come back to you in a bit. Please.
Okay. I think Corbyn struggles to engage with the media landscape as it is, which is that more people buy right-wing papers than left-wing papers. There are lots of left-wing publications out there, but unfortunately the Guardian and the Mirror just aren't pulling in the circulation that those papers that express a centre-right or right-wing perspective do. Similarly with the Spectator and the New Statesman, we have many more readers than the New Statesman do, and there is no barrier to going to buy those left-wing publications, yet people in Britain seem to be buying centre-right or right-wing publications. And perhaps we can wish that it would be a more equal world where 50% of publications were left-wing, but that's not the way the market is working. And for a political party to be successful, it just needs to deal with the media as it is and to not engage at all.
To be really clear then, so people are buying more right-wing pieces of sort of
people are
publications,
buying
but those
fewer
publications are...
People are buying fewer newspapers
but those
overall.
publications are not biased, is the contention. I'm going to come then to Anthony to sort of, you've worked in this space communicating from the left. Your thoughts on media and communications?
I'm not sure I want to start with I think that I think it's sort of shocking in a way to simply say, well, we've got a lying, venal, misleading media, but more people are buying it, so it's sort of free. And I completely agree with you that there are weaknesses of drama and presentation and argument on the left. And this point about renewal, which John was saying, I think when you're talking about, well, we didn't renew ourselves, the Labour Party. It's not. There have to be. You have to renew it around core ideas. If you're recruiting a new generation, where are the ideas which command the project, which will renew yourself? So and it can't just be done because it's a matter of. So if you say with New Labour of poor management or of not bringing people on, there've got to be some kind of project, transformative project. And I'm still not sure. You see, this is one of the point I have when John. This has got to do with these Johns. When you were saying that the right, the only way the right can get elected is by following the left-wing third way. What was so left-wing about the third way? So I think that the third way came out of a deal, if you like, through the original Clinton. And with a way of trying to turn the surplus from the financial sector into welfare with the collapse of the industrial working class. So it had that left-wing redistributive element to it, but it was about making international capitalism work. And when international capitalism, all right, but I mean, it's a
socialist project.
Right. Well, that's fine. That's fine.
That's a redefinition of socialism,
No.
I suspect.
It's the modern socialist project.
Well, no, but there is a social democratic project, and a serious one, of making capitalism work for everybody, and then when it stopped working for everybody. But I'm not sure that when the New Labour had power, it was making it work for everybody. This is another. This has got us off the question of media. Can I just make one point towards what Archie said on then I'll shut up.
Yeah.
I think the
Heroic
point
leaders,
that Archie Brown made about the fetishization of leadership in British politics, which we're now having another example of with the present Prime Minister, is a very strong point, and that's a very good point. But let's also comes from the weakness of not having a shared ideology and a shared purpose, which is where you can hold groups of people to account and they can hold each other to account. And when that's hollowed out, then you do have to, it's not just simply accident that our political parties are so leader-centric, or that our media is so leader-centric.
So
Great
that's
stories.
the communication of the ideology, the missing ideology itself. Tim, let me bring you in terms of communicating to the memberships. You've got a very good sense of who the party members are. Is this a sort of failure to communicate to the electorate, to the membership, from the sort of core of the Parliamentary Labour Party? What's going on?
I mean, I want to go back a little bit more, actually, to the point that was made there, just about ideology. I mean, I do think, in some ways, that without being too highfalutin about it, it's the centre-right and the right in politics, actually right across Europe in some ways, who are better Gramscians, if you like, than the left. You know, they seem better able to establish a common sense about what is and isn't feasible than the left, apart from perhaps during the early Blair years, where I think, you know, there was an attempt to do that, and a systematic attempt to do that, which for a while worked, actually. Somehow it began to dissipate and it began to fail. And I don't think, however, that the left is sort of completely doomed. I don't think the right necessarily have a monopoly on that kind of common sense, but it does require a lot of work, I think, from the left to do that. I just actually wanted to come back on something that somebody said about media bias. And coming back to the question of Brexit, I mean, if you look at the places that voted leave and you look at the places that voted remain, many of the places that voted remain would have been full of people reading those same right-wing newspapers, watching the same television programs as the people in the areas who voted leave. Okay? Now, I just can't see that media bias explains the difference between the two types of constituency. There must be more going on than the papers people read or the television programs they watch.
And the specific question, the coverage of Jeremy Corbyn, because I think this is that's what the question.
Well, on the coverage of Jeremy Corbyn, I think you're absolutely right to say that it has been very negative. That LSE study was very interesting. The problem with that LSE study was that there was no comparison. We didn't get to see what the coverage of David Cameron, for example, was like, or the coverage of Ed Miliband, and we couldn't really compare. It's probably a little bit worse, but it's not that much worse than the coverage of most politicians. And it brings me to one other thing. We've been talking about sort of leader-centric politics. Well, I'm afraid this is the game that we are now in. I think as ideology and tribal loyalty has become less important to voters all around Europe, to be honest, voters tend, and research seems to show this, to put kind of leadership a little bit further up in the mix when they're making their decision on voting. So it's not necessarily driven by the media's focus on leaders. It's the fact that people in some senses are replacing those tribal loyalties and replacing those big ideological visions that they used to maybe think about with leadership to some extent. So that's inevitable. And final one about, you know, well, surely if the Labour Party hadn't made the decision to allow the leader to pick the shadow cabinet, it would have been better. Jeremy Corbyn would have been placed in an impossible position. I don't think it's possible to place Jeremy Corbyn in an impossible position. I don't think that this is a man, you know, who would recognise an impossible position if it came up and slapped him in the face. That's just not the type of guy he is. You know?
Okay, John Woodcock, let me bring you in. So this question of heroism and heroic figures needed within the Labour Party.
Yeah, I think Tim's absolutely right, and just let me expand on both the points. I mean, Professor Brown, when you said the problem with the PLP was it allowed Ed Miliband, I thought you were going to stop then, and I was going to wholeheartedly agree with you. But this was Tim is right in the sense of what makes Jeremy Corbyn's leadership so dangerous to the continuing existence of the Labour Party is that he does not recognise any other barometer that any other leader in our history would have done. I mean, he is prepared to absolutely destroy the Labour Party as a governing force in Britain rather than step down. And so, yes, it would have been a slightly more extreme version of what we have at the moment, where 80% of his MPs say that he won't do it. He'd have been going to the country, he'd have been doing email plebiscites week after week, and I mean, we'd have been even more chaotic and even more shambolic from looking at the outside, but he wouldn't have gone.
Can I push you a little bit on this? So
Sure.
Jeremy Corbyn's been head of the leader of the Labour Party for 10 months.
Mm-hmm.
So but the crisis in the Labour Party presumably goes way back beyond the sort of last 10 months, right? You haven't been in power and sort of haven't managed to sort of secure a big share of the vote sort of in the last 2 elections, right? So it goes deeper than Jeremy Corbyn.
Yes, it does, but the idea that you look at the shortcomings of the Gordon Brown government and then Ed Miliband's failure to reconnect with the public, to understand actually that the mood in the country was much more fearful, much more concerned about personal security and personal economic security, and see those two fail and think that the answer is Jeremy Corbyn, I mean, seems to me a massive leap of logic. But hell, I was one of the chief people who was helping run the campaign of Liz Kendall, who got 4.5% of the vote. So I'm massively out of step, or have been out of step, with the membership of the Labour Party. But I have to say, I think probably slightly more in step with where the rest of the country has been, and I think that is a big disconnect that we have. Very quickly on the media thing, I mean, I just have to say, I think the reason that Jeremy Corbyn has got such appalling media is because he said such appalling things, and has promoted a shadow chancellor who praises the ballot, the bullet, and the bomb. Has called terrorist friends, who has done a series of things which in previous life would be absolutely unspeakable. And yet it is people like me who have been criticised for saying, actually, this is just beyond the pale. This is not what the Labour Party is supposed to be about. And then this myth of the MSM, the mainstream media, that apparently are to blame for all the Labour Party's troubles. It is a classic hard left. Let's find someone else to blame. And you use the example of, what was the phrase you used about pernicious lies, corruption of the of establishment? Well, yeah, I mean, all media is biased. The pull of print newspaper is far less than it was. And there is no worse example, I think, of pernicious lies that are being perpetrated in the media, on social media, by the likes of Momentum and some of the people who are around Jeremy Corbyn. It is utterly disgraceful what they are doing.
And somebody else who's commentator in the media quite often. John McTernan, do you want to come in on this last point here about communication, then we'll open up the floor again.
I've written for newspapers for a lot of my adult life, and I am absolutely certain that the most important news medium that people encounter is television, which is incredibly highly regulated. So that people don't need to read a column by me saying Jeremy Corbyn is appalling at Prime Minister's questions, although my column was very good and you can get it on the Telegraph website. They see him on the BBC or the ITV or the Channel 4 News, all of which are regulated by a regulator. They have audiences. I mean, even PMQs itself has an audience that outstrips many newspaper circulation. So that's just the show, as they call it in America, the PMQ show. So my thing, I want to add together, I think is what Ed said and what Jonathan said. The problem of the left is not his ideological power in trying to combat hegemonic myths. The problem of the left is trying to pretend that what the public think isn't real. The reason why Labour lost in 2010 and 2015 is that the public thought that they didn't trust us on the economy, on welfare, or immigration, to which now Corbyn has added defence. Now, you can believe, if you wish, that the public are wrong to think that your policies on the economy, on welfare, immigration, defence are hegemonic myths which should be challenged. Or you could have the humility to think there's something in there, the public have got a point. And you might want to shift, you might want to say the 2015 election, when 51% of the population voted for right-wing parties, was not a signal that Labour were insufficiently left-wing. So you'd actually have to say, what would be a progressive engagement on these issues? And it is very simple to see what progressive engagement is. I'll take the difficult one, immigration, right? There is no progress in politics without conflict, and there is no conflict without will and good politics on the side of the progressives. London is the most Labour part of the country, the most socially diverse part of the country, and the most economically successful part of the country. That is not a coincidence, but that also came out of struggles against the National Front. It came out of people in Lewisham Council taking a stand against the National Front about the New Cross fire. It was not easy to make London the tolerant city that it is, but it was Labour that put in place in the 70s the race discrimination legislation. It was Labour who stood up. It was Labour. Race has been the central fact of British political life since the 1960s. That has been the driving force. It was the driving force in the 60s, from Enoch Powell to Brexit. Race is the central issue of British politics. And so what do you do with a central issue? You engage with it. But you don't say there's a hegemonic myth or find a new form of communication. You deal with an issue straightforwardly.
Okay, good. We're talking about listening to the public. Let's listen to the public. Let's take 5 questions from the floor. The lady in the second row here. Gentleman here, gentleman there, and there's a gentleman in the blue shirt here, and then I've got one more, and I go with the gentleman in the back there. Great.
I'm Judith Cheetham. I'm a social worker, former fellow at Green Templeton College. We've been hearing a good deal about the disillusion of many of the people who are following Corbyn and the people who are probably joining now with parliamentary democracy and the possibility of change through government, and indeed Corbyn's own views about that. What do we understand about these people's views of how the miseries of which they are very well aware and which exist could be changed? What do they see as the way forward, the practical way forward?
Then the question is how to reconnect with this group of people who are.
Well, how to reconnect, but we can only reconnect if we understand what they feel is a sensible and legitimate way forward, or is the despair so great? The thing is, there's no point, we just give up in trying to change the world.
Yeah. Great.
My name's Sam Dawes. I'm a research associate at the university and former civil servant for the UK government. I really love the panel and agreed with almost everything that people said. There was one aspect of what makes Jeremy Corbyn unappealing to someone on the centre left that hasn't been sort of raised. So, and I was thinking that it's not really his lack of ability to get a team to support him, whether that's really clearly there. It's not just his lack of ability to communicate, and that's got better, and I think in the last couple of days, but it's still pretty bad. And it's not the policies he's holding, because I think a lot of people might go along with unilateral disarmament or other things if it's put in a different way. But the thing that struck me is his lack of empathy for anybody that doesn't believe what he believes, his lack of sort of any self-depreciation, humour. It reminds me of sort of the Norman Tebbits of this world, and so I'm wondering whether that is part of the phenomenon that is actually driving so much of the antagonism towards him and others of his ilk who don't really don't believe in the democratic incrementalism.
I'm quite struck about how we're sort of focusing on Jeremy Corbyn, although we're saying such big issues are at stake here. The gentleman in the
I would like, my name is Rick Leitenberger. I'm a PhD student in history here, and perhaps from the get-go I am not a British citizen, so perhaps I bring a more continental European perspective into this. One question that I would ask in that sense is, we've spoken of the crisis of the left, and the crisis of the right has also been mentioned. When personally looking at the way in which British politics work. I personally would have rather have the impression that what we really have is a crisis of liberalism, in the sense as that the British centre has quintessentially collapsed as a result of the Brexit vote, both on the Tory party and on the Labour party, and that the real problem is that it is, as Professor Tim Bale said at the beginning, a situation where a great share of the population wants to move back to a more authoritarian kind of model. Whether that is left or right is, if you will, at the end of the day, up to interpretation. But that is what the actual crisis is. It's not a left-in crisis or a right-in crisis. It's a liberal centre that is in crisis. And how do you think? And that basically anything that relates to that in terms of the party crisis is in fact, if you will, a proxy war for a wider philosophical problem. And that in turn, this also relates to the paradox of leave, I'll finish, that even though it was secured by self-proclaimed libertarians, at the end of the day, this was a way of pulling up the drawbridge, was also shown by the fact that those who argued the liberal case for leave were willing to ignore all the basic realities of what they were being told by those partners they wanted to get involved with. And so at the end of the day, this was about a Britain looking inwards, being slightly more in a regulated state that is more, if you will, authoritarian than liberal and outward looking. And whether you would agree with that and how to tackle that is my question.
A new crisis on the table, which is crisis of liberalism. Right. Gentleman behind you, just here. No, gentleman just there, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Councillor Saj Malik. I'm a local Labour councillor. I'm not a member of Momentum, but I'm equally annoyed what's going on. I will start from the Brexit side, for example. While it's widely said is a fault of Jeremy Corbyn, to me, the way I look at it, I think the Labour Party, PLP, need to look at their own system. Those northeast, northwest areas, most deprived areas. Labour came and gone. When our industry collapsed, what regeneration program took place under those member of parliaments? How the employment been skewed or not? Where the investment come from? So it's not very fair to just go along when the survey says 65% Labour supporter voted for Remain. So just going along. But with the respect to my PLP, I'm slightly annoyed when somebody has the aspiration to become a leader. Say, for example, Chakra Amuna or Tristram Hunt. The very first conference, when the leader is about to address and he's been elected, they've been caught and they've been filmed and reported catching an early train without listening to the leader debate. So there are certain sections within the PLP which are not giving a man a chance. I totally take the John's word on his face value because I'm not in it. We only just read and hear rumors from out of the things. And the question to the panel basically is on the immigration side, where all the three major parties duck the question. And what I find coming from BME minority origin is, if any white person want to speak about immigration, he or she will straight away branded a racist. But these are the debate people want to engage with you. So you have to do that. Secondly, on the...
Thank you very much. There was one more question yet, gentleman there. And then we'll come back to the panel. And I'm afraid we're going to be out of time for questions. There's a lady who wants to... Okay, I'll take two more questions, because otherwise then we'll come back to the panel for a wrap-up session.
Looking at the north of England now with UKIP's Dixiecrat tanks on Labour's territory, it looks very much like the west of Scotland 2007 to 2011, where Labour had an opinion poll lead on the fundamental, but their position was very weak. So my question is, when do the panel think Theresa May will resolve her political problems by calling a general election, and what will the impact of that general election be on Labour in the north?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm going off to...
Sort of touched on two questions there. Yeah, so general election and Theresa May. There's two questions I can see here. Let's take those, and then that'll be it for... We'll come back to the panel.
My name's Chris White, and I run a small business in central London in the fruit sector, as it happens. It seems to me that the crisis of the left is that, as far as I'm concerned, is they don't seem to be able to articulate a kind of... I want to hear what of a country we want to go to, of where we want, of a destination that we want to arrive at, to coin a phrase, a new dawn has broken, has it not? That's what I want to hear, and I don't get that from the left. I tend to hear it a little bit from the right, and I'd love to hear it from the left, because that's what I think we need to be hoping for.
Great, thank you. And last question, maybe.
there are so many things swirling around here, but I have to say what struck me from most of it is that much of what's happening strikes me as though it's a more profound crisis of capitalism that is translating into a crisis of liberalism, a crisis of the right, a crisis of the left. What I hear sounds very much like the crisis portion of Polanyi's Great Transformation, where you have a tendency towards populism, polarization, a shift towards fascism and isolationism, and financial crisis. I was very struck by what one gentleman said, pointing out that you could say 2 of the things that happened with the banking crisis, but not 3. It seems to me that the right can't say that their ideology has failed, that the state had to bail out the market, but they pretend that everything is fine, it's okay that they were bailed out, it's all good. And the left can't afford to say that they were right and that the market can't run things, because they can't afford to annoy business. And I'm wondering if we're talking about the crisis of the Labour Party, but it seems to me there's a huge silent partner in all of this that's not about the political right or the political left, but about the enormous power of business, global business, local business, in shaping what can win, what is politically credible. So my question is, do we not have a division between the requirements of representation, of political representation, particularly of those people who require more at this stage than they have to offer to the market, who have nothing to sell, who are more expensive to train than taking graduates from Poland or Kenya or wherever else that we so happily poach in this country, and who really feel that this is my country and I want to say something, I want to be represented, and on the other hand, power. So we're struggling between actually representing the people in this country in a cosmopolitan way, but in a way that meets their needs and their concerns, and the demands of power, which actually means answering to the silent partner rather than answering to the people. So I'm wondering if the panel could respond to that.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go in reverse order to how everyone spoke. So John Woodcock.
Okay.
Any of the issues on the table.
Yeah,
and
well,
then
very quickly, Sam, I agree with you. Chris, I agree with you in terms of vision of the future. That's, I think, where we failed in the 2010. Well, very in a micro way, the Labour Party, the people who I think could offer a more a coherent and winnable direction, have not been able to translate that into a proper vision of the future, which has been able to take the Labour Party with them, and therefore we have not been able to even have the chance to take the country with us.
From the sound of that, it is a deep crisis about the identity.
Yes, I mean, I think.
Agenda of the Labour Party.
Yes, the problem has resulted in the catastrophe of Jeremy Corbyn, which may well break the Labour Party forever. But yes, his ability to come to power is part of a much wider failure, of course. And then just finally on the crisis of liberalism. Sorry, and I didn't catch your name at the beginning, but I thought this does go to the nub of the matter, and it wraps up in about did Labour transform communities in the north? I think it's a bit unfair to say, oh well, look, it's okay. Jeremy Corbyn did okay in Islington, so he did his bit, and but then the rest of the north voted wrong, and so it was all our fault. But certainly, I think that the last Labour government, did not transform the circumstances of too many communities across the country. Now, that was a massive thing to do, and in some ways it was too timid. In other ways, it just used the wrong levers. But we used to finally, we used to talk to Tony Blair. Used to stand up and he used to put all these obvious choices, he'd be at his conference and he said, and shall I give up or shall I go forward? And everyone said, go forward. And one of his favourite things was, do we want a society which is open or closed? And what you saw in the EU referendum, as has been mentioned, is actually the public said, no, we want a closed society. We are not happy with this. And this is the big battle. Can we, on the left, reconfigure an argument about us looking outwards and how that is a good thing for our country and the people who are less well off in it, or are we going to allow the right to define what a new vision of a more closed, inward-looking society is going to be?
I'm ready to vote for the UK in the north.
Mm-hmm.
John, your thoughts on any of these questions?
So there's some very simple issues which one can deal with. Two giant ones hanging over loads of people, housing and pensions. There's a very straightforward, progressive, public-private partnership that could be articulated that could actually engage with issues that people are really concerned with. You can actually take a specific things and do something for them. On what's it make, it's very interesting about what makes Jeremy Corbyn unappealing. He is absolutely uncommitted to the other side of empathy, of winning an argument, persuasion. He likes to be in rallies, contexts where people believe in everything he says. In some sense, his favourite position is as victim. He's a kind of covert narcissist, where it's all about him. And being a victim is perfect for him, and that's why even an elected shadow cabinet wouldn't have sourced it for him. The crisis of liberalism, there's a crisis definitely of progressive centrist policies, in that that's what the public actually want, but there's a vacancy of, on the right or the left, really hard-edged progressive policies. I agree with you that talking about immigration is not racist. I do think, though, that there are views and articulations of views which are racist, and you have to be quite careful. You have to be really clear about these things. I'm in favour of immigration. It's made our country great. It's made our country better. We'd be a nasty, smaller country if we didn't have immigration. If you don't believe that, I mean, go to parts of Scotland where they don't have experience there. 1.5% black and ethnic minority in Scotland. That's racially and socially homogenous places are not pleasant.
General election?
Well, on future, left parties always win on future and fairness. And if you can't articulate a vision of fairness, you can't win. But it's got to be a vision of fairness in the future. You can win. In terms of the general election, Theresa May should have it immediately because she would destroy the Labour Party. She will not do it quickly enough. She'll do a Gordon Brown. She won't hold it, and she will wait until she's got a crisis in her own party, which paralyses her too. That's going to be the problem. She'll keep on saying, not now, not yet, time's not right, time not right. The time is ripe. She should do it now. She won't do it, and so 2020 will be the most unpredictable election. So we'll turn to Isabel for prediction on that at some point.
Yes. Anthony.
Yes, very interesting questions and very wide-ranging. I agree about the point about the 2020 election, though I don't think she should hold it. She said in running as a candidate that she wouldn't. She has to deliver Brexit, whatever that means. And I think if she tried to hold an election now, it would, UKIP would say she was frit, what is she trying to do, what is the deal that she's trying to make. If she simply tried to cash in on the current advantage, we don't know what would follow. But I think the system would start to blow. So, and I'd just like to say, I think, two things. So the first is, which comes from the question which is being asked by I don't know what country you're from? Germany. From Germany. Your English is excellent. About what happened during the referendum. And I think, it was a very disastrous and in a way, a very shameful decision. But I also think it was, in a certain sense, a very democratic and a very brave decision in which millions of people, in the face of all the economic advice that they were getting, said they were not going to vote on a transactional basis, and that they were going to vote for some or other to be self-governing. And they were voting against Blair and Brown and the Third Way and Cameron and the soup and the fog and the fatalism that had. And this is a very important aspect. They were told, and many, I think, were not against immigration, but were being told that there was nothing could be done about the pressure that was being put on their housing or being put on their resources by immigration, because nothing could be done. And that sense of being told by people who are powerful that government is now beyond them was intolerable. So that there's an element of the while profoundly disagreeing with the Brexit conclusion and apologising to our German friend for what this country has done to itself and to Europe, I think we need to recognise, and Europe needs to recognise, that there is a democratic impulse there which we either leave to populists or we have to respond to and to take further.
And can I just probably on this question about whether big business, in the sort of the shadow of big business, is why the left has failed to really deliver a sort of vision for addressing those inequalities?
Well, I think the thing about the left vision is it's an element of taking business on, but you have to take business on. This is where I think all this stuff about policy and so on is not the point. What kind of country, if we're going to talk about the future of what, right? Which country are we talking about? So when people say we should be open, this is the consequence, we should be open in terms of should we be European? That openness in the context of the referendum is being European. And where was the politician or the leader in the referendum debate that said, I want to be, Cameron and was saying, I want to be a great gutsy, I'm a piratical leader of Great Britain. And Gordon Brown, who was the most articulate, said finally at the end dragged out, said we want to lead in Europe. If European came, we must lead. If Germans said we must lead in Britain, what would we say to that? Well, we already had it with Obama. Obama was scripted by the government because he was really popular to tell us what to do, and actually that was the moment in which the Remain campaign lost it. We're not going. So the national question, and that involves the English question as well, and the European question, is really at the heart of this. And having and the left, one of the, sorry, I'm being a bit articulate. I must finish my sentences. The New Labour, when it was very good about these, the third wave is we must be open, was really saying, we must join this governing force and cash in, and it helped to generate the fatalism that it was imposing on people. And while it was winning, and while it was winning in wars, and while it was winning economically, it could get away with it. And when, after the crash, that's why the crash had such a devastating impact, because while the banks were saved, we had no language, including the left had no language, of justifying government intervention and taking responsibility for those policies. And so if we want to see a revived left, it's got to be one that can speak for the country.
Will it
Maybe
happen?
I can hand over
Isabel, yes, because your prediction now. Will it, the revival of the left, are we going to see it?
I have learned my lesson about predictions. I've learned my lesson. I absolutely loved your question about how we make things change and how we give people faith and trust that Parliament and that politicians can change things. And one of the things I think is really important is that politicians need to be more self-confident. And I know we all think that politicians are very arrogant, but I think they have very low esteem in politics, and they reinforce the public's low esteem in politics by saying things like, we need to take the politics out of this. Now, what they mean, I think, is partisan, petty point scoring, because politics is actually a force for change and a force for debate and ideas. But when they say that, it's because actually they don't want to make a decision themselves, and they then farm the decision out to a Royal Commission or a Quango or someone else. And then when the decision is taken, they go, oh God, we didn't want them to take a decision. Now we actually have to implement it, like on airports or like even on their own pay, which they farmed out to Ipswich, and then went, oh no, we don't want a pay rise. People will get cross. And so it's that lack of confidence in actually doing what you're elected to do as a politician and paid to do, which is to be better informed than your voters because you do it full time, and then to take decisions on their behalf. And when you approach difficult decisions, to take them.
And what would take to change that?
I think greater self-confidence. I think also, so politicians can also then end up wasting parliamentary time by debating things that aren't going to help. So we could have lots of debates about the social care crisis, which I'm sure you find incredibly upsetting and frustrating very regularly. But actually we had 3-hour debates on whether to ban Donald Trump from the United Kingdom or whether to rename ISIS Daesh, which are interesting, but they're not the most important things, renaming terrorist groups to sort of scare them off in some way. I think also having self-confidence to having sort of defended the status quo in the media, to ignore the media, because the way we judge politicians is really unhelpful. We have a very short-term approach to them, and one of the sort of best examples of this is when there's a reshuffle, and someone gets sacked, and lots of my lobby colleagues will go, oh, very able minister. And we've got no idea. So, for instance, when Jeremy Brown was sacked from the Home Office in the last Parliament, all my colleagues were saying, very able minister, real shock. And I spoke to some people in the Home Office who said, oh, we didn't have a clue what he did most of the time. And I realised that actually the way we'd evaluated Jeremy Brown's abilities as a minister was that he was really good to go for lunch with. And he stayed for pudding, and he was really interesting. And actually, this was all just the lobby being lazy and thinking, this guy's interesting, therefore he's a good minister. And that's terrible, and I can't defend that. And it's the short-term judgments that we reach that mean that ministers are always coming out with announcements of like small pots of money that make no difference to anyone's lives, rather than thinking about the long term. So under the Labour government, I think it was in the middle of the Labour government, a minister who was never thanked for it set up the teenage pregnancy strategy. And we heard in the past few months that it has had a huge success rate in halving teenage pregnancies in this country. That minister isn't in Parliament anymore, never got the praise for that. It was probably never written up when that minister was moved, that they'd set up this long-term plan for solving a huge social problem. And that's a problem of the media, but also it's the problem of politicians not actually having the strength of mind to ignore our short-term media who are more interested in who's fun to have lunch with.
Thank you. I think that gives us some good ideas about reform then of the parliamentary system to actually make it work better, and perhaps some of your colleagues doing a bit more diligent work rather than just waiting for pudding or not. Okay, Tim, over to you for last. Yes,
I won't try and answer all the questions or even answer them in turn. I mean, somebody mentioned Peter Mayer before, who's a political scientist who wrote about parties and died 2-3 years ago, very sadly, very young and very unexpectedly. But Peter, I think, was right when he said that governments and indeed parties face this continual trade-off between being responsive to their electorate or to their members on the one hand, and being responsible on the other. And I think that is a useful way of seeing politics, and it's a useful way of seeing, you know, the politics of the left and the politics in the Labour Party as well, because at the moment we have got a Labour Party leader who is ultra responsive to his members, but that may mean that he's traded that off against being responsible in terms of his stewardship of the party and what he needs to do to actually get that party into power. And I think, you know, in some ways Theresa May with Brexit faces the same trade-off there, because in some ways she's obviously very tempted to be responsive to the Brexit vote, and, you know, Brexit means Brexit, but also responsive in the sense of thinking this is partly about cultural concerns about immigration, and therefore saying to herself and possibly to us, because this crunch will come, you know, I'd rather we were a slightly poorer country with control over our borders than a richer country with less control. And that might be the trade-off that she makes. Now, for me, that is placing responsiveness above responsibility, but there we are. That's a trade-off that she will make. But I think that's a useful way of thinking about all these things. The other thing I'd just say, in answer to a particular question, having said I wouldn't answer a particular question, the early general election, I mean, I think John might be right that it will be put off. But on the other hand, I can see Theresa May, partly because she's done some unexpected things. After all of us went on the media and said she's very conscientious, she's very cautious, and she won't do anything silly. She appoints Boris Johnson, she does all this kind of stuff. You know, for her to go back to this awful language I use about incentives, I mean, there are three very obvious incentives for Theresa May to call an election, not this autumn, because we don't do autumn elections in this country, but in spring and summer. The first one is, when the going gets tough, people will say, you haven't got a mandate, nobody voted for you. Constitutionally, that's absurd, but it's an argument that plays quite well, I think, for lots of people and in the media. So she might want that personal mandate. The second reason is because she only has a working majority of 12, and she's going to have to do an awful lot of very difficult stuff, and she's going to have to disappoint the headbangers in her party, even given what I said about the trade-offs that she and which way she might jump on that. Now, you know, I'm not sure she can actually get through to 2020 with a majority of 12 once the decisions, you know, which flow from Brexit, and negotiations that flow from Brexit go on. I'd want a bigger insurance policy and a cushion if I were her. So, you know, but obviously I'm not her. But then that's the other incentive. And then the third incentive is the one that John said. I mean, you know, she will absolutely cream the Labour Party. There may never be, you know, as good a chance And you know, I find it very difficult to believe with all those three incentives that, you know, she won't actually go for it. And I know people say we've got the Fixed Term Parliament Act. Oh, that's a lot that can be unpicked because the Conservative the party in Parliament will simply vote no confidence in itself, and no Labour MP will be able to say, oh no, we don't want an election against this terrible Conservative. Yeah.
The same line, it's very hard for them to.
So if I was a betting man, and if I was, you know,
now we need to go down the bookies from here.
Yeah. If I was not afraid of making absurd predictions, and of course I've got lots of things wrong as well, I would say, you know, we probably are in for a general election next year, or maybe the year after, but probably next year.
Thank you very much. It's a very nice framing, I think, to wrap up and think for all of us who live in a parliamentary democracy, what we actually want from our representatives. How much responsiveness do we want, and how much responsibility do we want to see as we go to elect, perhaps in a general election a year from now. Thank you very much. Let's thank our speakers, and thanks to you as well for being an excellent audience.